And when she has practiced until she can play Bonaparte crossing the Alps, and you can't tell after she has played it whether Bonaparte ever got across or not. Men are oaks, women are vines, children are flowers, and if there is any heaven in this world, it is in the family. It is where the wife loves the husband, and the husband loves the wife, and where the dimpled arms of children are about the necks of both. That is heaven, if there is any, and I do not want any better heaven in another world than that. And if in another world I cannot live with the ones I loved here, then I would rather not be there. I would rather resign. Well, my friends, I have some excuses to make for the race to which I belong. In the first place, this world is not very well adapted to raising good men and good women. It is 3 times better adapted to the cultivation of fish than of people. There is one little narrow belt running zigzag around the world in which men and women of genius can be raised, and that is all. It is with man as it is with vegetation. In the valley you find the oak and elm tossing their branches defiantly to the storm, and as you advance up the mountainside, the hemlock, the pine, the birch, the spruce, the fir, and finally you come to little dwarfed trees that look like other trees seen through a telescope reversed, every limb twisted as through pain, getting a scanty subsistence from the miserly crevices of the rocks. You go on and on until at last the highest crag is freckled with a kind of moss, and vegetation ends. You might as well try to raise oaks and elms where the mosses grow as to raise great men and women where their surroundings are unfavorable. You must have the proper climate and soil. There never has been a man or woman of genius from the southern hemisphere, because the Lord didn't allow the right climate to fall upon the land. It falls upon the water. There never was much civilization except where there has been snow, an ordinarily decent winter. You can't have civilization without it. Where man needs no bedclothes but clouds, revolution is the normal condition of such a people. It is the winter that gives us the home. It is the winter that gives us the fireside and the family relation and all the beautiful flowers of love that adorn that relation. Civilization, liberty, justice, charity, and intellectual advancement are all flowers that bloom in the drifted snow. You can't have them anywhere else, and that is the reason we of the North are civilized, and that is the reason that civilization has always been with winter. That is the reason that philosophy has been here, and in spite of all our superstitions, we have advanced beyond some of the other races, because we have had this assistance of nature, that drove us into the family relation, that made us prudent, that made us lay up at one time for another season of the year. So there is one excuse I have for my race. I have got another. I think we came from the lower animals. I am not dead sure of it, but I think so. When I first read about it, I didn't like it. My heart was filled with sympathy for those people who have nothing to be proud of except ancestors. I thought how terrible it will be upon the nobility of the old world. Think of their being forced to trace their ancestry back to the Duke Orangutan or to the Princess Chimpanzee. After thinking it all over, I came to the conclusion that I liked that doctrine. I became convinced in spite of myself. I read about rudimentary bone and muscles. I was told that everybody had rudimentary muscles extending from the ear into the cheek. I asked, what are they? I was told they are the remains of muscles, that they became rudimentary from lack of use. They went into bankruptcy. They are the muscles with which your ancestors used to flap their ears. Well, at first I was greatly astonished, and afterward I was more astonished to find they had become rudimentary. How can you account for John Calvin unless we came up from the lower animals? How could you account for a man that would use the extremes of torture unless you admit that there is in man the elements of a snake, of a vulture, of a hyena, and a jackal. How can you account for the religious creeds of today? How can you account for that infamous doctrine of hell except with an animal origin? How can you account for your conception of a God that would sell women and babes into slavery? Well, I thought that thing over, and I began to like it after a while. And I said, it is not so much difference who my father was as who his son is. And I finally said I would rather belong to a race that commenced with the skull-less vertebrates in the dim Laurentian seas, that wriggled without knowing why they wriggled, swimming without knowing where they were going, that come along up by degrees, through millions of ages, through all that crawls and swims and floats and runs and growls and barks and howls until it struck this fellow in the dugout. And then that fellow in the dugout getting a little grander, and each one below calling every one above him a heretic, calling every one who had made a little advance an infidel or an atheist, and finally the heads getting a little higher and looming up a little grander and more splendidly, and finally produced Shakespeare, who harvested all the field of dramatic thought, and from whose day until now there have been none but gleaners of chaff and straw. Shakespeare was an intellectual ocean whose waves touched all the shores of human thought, within which were all the tides and currents and pulses, upon which lay all the lights and shadows, and over which brooded all the calms, and swept all the storms and tempests of which the soul is capable. I would rather belong to that race that commenced with that skull-less vertebrate, that produced Shakespeare, a race that has before it an infinite future, with the angel of progress leaning from the far horizon, beckoning men forward and upward forever. I would rather belong to that race than to have descended from a perfect pair, upon which the Lord has lost money every moment from that day to this. Now, my crime has been this: I have insisted that the Bible is not the Word of God. I have insisted that we should not whip our children. I have insisted that we should treat our wives as loving equals. I have denied that God, if there is any God, ever upheld polygamy and slavery. I have denied that that God ever told his generals to kill innocent babes and tear and rip open women with the sword of war. I have denied that, and for that I have been assailed by the clergy of the United States. They tell me I have misquoted, and I owe it to you, and maybe I owe it to myself, to read one or two words to you upon this subject. In order to do that I shall have to put on my glasses, and that brings me back to where I started, that man has advanced just in proportion as his thought has mingled with his labor. If man's eyes hadn't failed, he would never have made any spectacles. He would never have had the telescope, and he would never have been able to read the leaves of heaven. End of Ingersoll's lecture on skulls. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Ingersoll's lecture on skulls is from the book Lectures of Colonel Robert Greene Ingersoll, read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during August 2007.